There are people whose lives sound like music, not because everything was beautiful, but because they refused, even when the world demanded it, to stop playing. This is the story of Elena, and of everything they tried to silence. The city where Elena was born had a name that most people in the world would never learn to pronounce correctly. It was a city of wide boulevards and old stone buildings, of markets that smelled of bread and damp wool, of church bells that told you the hour whether you wanted to know it or not. Elena's family lived on the third floor of a building on the main square. Her father was a schoolteacher. Her mother, Irina, had trained as a classical pianist in her youth, before life, as she put it, had asked her to trade the concert hall for a kitchen and a family she loved more than any applause. But music, once it lives inside a person, does not simply leave. It waits. And in Elena it found a new home. Elena was 4 years old the first time she climbed onto the piano bench beside her mother, and placed her small hands on the keys. Irina watched her daughter's face, the absolute concentration, the hunger in those dark eyes, and understood, with the quiet certainty of someone who has known something her whole life, what she was looking at. She was looking at herself, 30 years younger, with a chance she never had. By the time Elena was 7, she had exhausted everything her mother could teach her. Irina took her to see a man named Mr. Hoffman, a retired conservatory professor who lived 2 streets away, surrounded by books, sheet music, and 3 cats that had learned to tolerate the sound of scales. Mr. Hoffman was not a warm man. He was precise, demanding, and allergic to shortcuts. He heard Elena play for 4 minutes and then said, without looking up from the sheet music, "She has ears that remember everything. That is the rarest thing. The technique I can teach. The ears, those are already there." Elena studied with Mr. Hoffman for 6 years. 6 years of scales at dawn, of pieces played until the fingertips ached, of a standard that never moved down to meet her, only ever demanded that she rise to meet it. She rose. On the night that changed everything, Elena was 17 years old. She had just returned from a school recital where she had performed a Chopin nocturne that made 2 teachers cry, and the school director stand up from his chair before the applause even began. She came home to find her parents in the kitchen, speaking in low voices with the lights turned down. On the table between them, a newspaper. Her father's face. Her mother's hands, perfectly still for the first time Elena could remember. That night, the city outside was quiet, but it was the quiet of something about to break. And Elena, standing in the hallway with her coat still on and her sheet music under her arm, already felt it. The way you feel a storm before the first drop of rain. Stay with Elena, because what happened in the next 72 hours would cost her everything, and build the foundation of something the world had never heard before. The conflict that tore Elena's city apart did not announce itself with a single dramatic moment. It came the way most catastrophes come, gradually at first, then all at once. Checkpoints appeared on the main boulevard. Then curfews. Then the sound of things in the distance that no one could explain to a 17-year-old girl in words she was supposed to hear. Elena's father made the decision on the 3rd day. "We have to go," he said. Not a question. Not a discussion. The voice of a man who has already done the calculation and knows what the answer costs. They had 8 hours. Elena stood in her bedroom and looked at the piano, the upright instrument that had lived in the corner of the parlor her entire life. Irina's piano, Elena's whole musical childhood, held inside a piece of wood and wire and ivory. She could not take it. She could take one thing. She opened the piano bench. Inside, beneath old programs and finger exercise sheets, was a small notebook, hand-stitched covers, pages filled with Irina's handwriting, original compositions, arrangements, notes in the margins, the musical memory of a woman who had traded the concert hall for a family and never stopped composing in secret. Elena put the notebook inside her coat. She did not look back at the piano. She had learned, without knowing she was learning it, that looking back at the things you love and cannot keep only makes them heavier to carry. The journey lasted 19 days. There were trains so crowded that people sat on top of their luggage in the aisles. There were border crossings where men in uniforms asked questions in languages Elena only partially understood. There were nights in transit centers, warehouses converted into shelters, rows of cots under fluorescent lights, the sound of other people's crying mixing with other people's prayers. Elena kept her hand on the notebook inside her coat at all times, even when she slept, especially when she slept. On the 14th day, in a temporary shelter in a port city whose name she would remember for the rest of her life, Elena found a piano. It was old. One key in the middle register was stuck completely silent. The pedals groaned. Someone had carved initials into the side panel that Elena traced with her finger without knowing whose they were. She sat down. She opened the notebook to the first page of her mother's handwriting, and she began to play. The room went quiet the way rooms only go quiet when something true is happening. People stopped mid-conversation. Children stopped moving. A man near the back wall who had not cried in 3 weeks of displacement put his face in his hands and wept without shame. Elena played for 40 minutes. She played everything in the notebook. When she finished, the silence lasted long enough that she thought perhaps she had done something wrong. Then the applause began, ragged, exhausted, genuine, the kind of applause that has nothing to do with performance and everything to do with recognition. The sound of people saying, "Yes, I am still here. I remember who I am." Among the people in that shelter was a man named Victor Crane. Victor was not a refugee. He was an American, a music promoter who had come to the region on a humanitarian mission with a cultural organization, accompanying a small ensemble that had been performing concerts in the camps. He was 51 years old, had been in the music industry for 30 years, and had long believed he had heard everything worth hearing. He had been standing near the door when Elena began to play. He did not move for the entire 40 minutes. Afterward, Victor Crane stood very still for a long moment. Then he walked directly to where Elena was closing the notebook and said, in English she barely understood, "I need to know your name, and I need to know if you have somewhere to go." Elena looked at this stranger in the good coat standing in the middle of a shelter with fluorescent lights and cots, and the smell of industrial soup. She said her name. She said she did not have somewhere to go. Victor Crane nodded slowly, and said, "You do now. New York in January is not a gentle city. The wind comes off the Hudson in ways that feel personal. The streets move at a speed that assumes you already know where you are going." Elena knew nothing. She spoke limited English, carried one bag and one notebook, and arrived at John F. Kennedy Airport on a Tuesday afternoon with the expression of someone who has decided, firmly and completely, not to be afraid while being absolutely terrified. Victor had arranged temporary housing, a small room in a building on the Upper West Side belonging to a woman named Mrs. Papadopoulos, who had been hosting musicians and artists in transit for 30 years, and who communicated almost entirely through food. On the first night, Mrs. Papadopoulos placed a plate of food in front of Elena without a word. Elena ate everything. Mrs. Papadopoulos nodded once, refilled the plate, and went back to her kitchen. This, Elena would later say, was the kindest thing anyone did for her in her first year in America. Victor Crane was a man of serious plans and modest promises. He did not tell Elena she was going to be famous. He told her she had something real, and that real things in the music world as in everything else require infrastructure. He arranged for her to audition at a conservatory in Manhattan. Elena prepared for 3 weeks. She played Irina's compositions alongside the classical repertoire she had learned from Mr. Hoffman, Chopin, Ravel, Schubert, and when the audition committee asked her to explain the original pieces, she described her mother. The committee sat in silence for a moment afterward. She was admitted, with a full scholarship. The next 3 years were the most demanding of Elena's life, and the most formative. She studied alongside students from 22 countries. She learned English not from textbooks but from music reviews, from conversations in practice rooms, from the city itself. She worked evenings at a coffee shop on Amsterdam Avenue to cover living expenses, coming home after midnight with tips in her pocket and compositions running through her head that she would write down before sleeping. She did not waste a single hour. Not because she was driven by ambition in the conventional sense, but because she carried Irina's notebook in her bag every single day. And every page of that notebook reminded her that talent without opportunity disappears. That her mother had been proof of that. That she would not be. In the spring of her second year, Victor arranged for Elena to perform at a small but prestigious venue in the West Village, a listening room that held 80 people and had hosted, over its 40-year history, musicians who had gone on to fill Carnegie Hall. Elena was 20 years old. The program she designed for that evening was unlike anything the venue had seen. She opened with a Ravel etude, technically flawless, warmly received. Then she played 3 of Irina's original compositions, which she introduced in her still accented English as music written by a woman who never had the chance to play it herself. By the second of her mother's pieces, there was not a sound in the room. By the third, a woman in the front row was openly crying. When Elena finished, the silence lasted 9 seconds, she counted, before the room erupted. In the audience that night was a music critic from a publication that covered classical and contemporary music across the American East Coast. The review he published 3 days later used the word transcendent. It said that Elena played as if the piano were a direct line between the living and the dead. It said that her mother's compositions were among the most beautiful pieces of original piano music he had heard in a decade. Said, "Remember this name." New York remembered. What happened over the following 3 years moved at a pace that Elena would later describe as dizzying, the way a storm is dizzying when you are standing at the center of it and cannot see the edges. The review was shared, republished, discussed. Victor received inquiries from venues in Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago. A record label reached out about a debut album. A radio program on a national classical music station invited Elena for a live performance and interview. Her first broadcast, conducted in English, she had by now mastered with the precision she applied to everything. The album, recorded over 6 weeks in a studio in Brooklyn, was titled simply Irina. 12 tracks, 6 classical pieces, 6 original compositions from her mother's notebook. The cover was a photograph of Elena's hands resting on the keys, Irina's handwritten notebook open beside them. It was released on a Friday in October. By Sunday it was the most discussed debut classical album in the country. The invitations came faster than Victor could answer them. A major network morning show, the kind watched by millions of Americans over breakfast, asked Elena to perform and give a short interview. She sat across from the host in a bright television studio and spoke about her mother, about the notebook, about the shelter where she had played a broken piano for people who had lost everything. The segment ran 7 minutes. The network's switchboard received more calls about it than any cultural segment in 3 years. The cover of a leading classical music magazine ran a portrait of Elena at the piano with a headline that read, "The voice that came from nowhere and changed everything." A national Sunday newspaper supplement published a feature-length profile, 4,000 words, photographs, an excerpt from one of Irina's original scores reproduced in full. Readers wrote letters to the editor about it for 2 months afterward. Elena was invited to perform at the Kennedy Center in Washington, at Symphony Hall in Chicago, at Davies Hall in San Francisco, at the Montreal Jazz Festival, where her presence on a classical program surprised the organizers and produced one of the most talked-about sets of the festival. She did not change the program. She did not simplify it or soften it, or edit out the parts that were specifically, unmistakably hers, the accent still present in her speaking voice, the original compositions from her mother's notebook, the brief spoken introduction she gave before each piece that audiences across the country had begun calling Elena's stories. She played exactly who she was, and people could not stop listening. Elena moved to Chicago at 24. The city suited her in ways she could not entirely explain. The cold that reminded her of home without the weight of home. The architecture that felt built to last. The music community that was serious without being closed. She bought an apartment on the north side. She established a practice schedule that her neighbors learned to time their mornings by. She continued to record, to perform, to accept the interviews and features and television appearances that continued to arrive with the regularity of seasons. She became, in the language the music press reached for when they tried to describe her, a phenomenon. But the word that the people who knew her used was different. They said disciplined. They said present. They said she never forgets where the music came from. At 26, Elena performed at Carnegie Hall. The program was identical to the one she had first played in that 80-seat listening room in the West Village. She walked onto the stage of the most famous concert hall in America and sat at the Steinway and played her mother's music to 3,000 people who had paid serious money to be there. Irina had never played Carnegie Hall. But that night, through her daughter's hands, she finally did. Elena's story is not a story without shadows. It would be dishonest to tell it as if success arrived without erosion. There were years when the touring schedule was so relentless that she lost track of seasons. Weeks in which the only constants were airports, dressing rooms, the backstage silence before she walked onto another stage in another city. She gave everything to the performances, and then came back to hotel rooms that were beautifully appointed and completely empty. She called her parents when she could. After her father's death, quietly in his sleep, in the city he had never left, she played Irina's first composition at every single concert for a year. Not announced. Not explained. Just played. Those who knew the program knew what it meant. There were relationships that did not survive the schedule. A man she had loved in her late 20s who had eventually said, with a sadness that was not anger, "Elena, I don't think there is room in your life for another person. The music takes everything." She did not argue, because he was not entirely wrong, but he was also not entirely right. In her 31st year, Elena's right hand began to hurt. Not an injury, not at first. A tendinitis that her doctor described as the predictable consequence of 30 years of high-level piano performance. She was told to rest. She rested for 2 weeks and went back to practicing. She was told again. More firmly. She took a month off. The month off was, Elena would say years later, the hardest thing she had ever done. Not because she could not live without playing, but because without the piano she had to live with herself. With the questions she had been able to avoid by always having something to practice, something to prepare, something to perform. She sat in her Chicago apartment for 4 weeks in the February cold and thought about her mother, about what Irina had wanted, about what she, Elena, had done with the gift and what she had neglected, about whether success, if it cost you everything outside of the thing you succeeded at, was worth its price. She did not arrive at clean answers, but she arrived at something more useful, clarity. When Elena returned to the stage, she added one new element to her life. She began teaching. Not formally, not at a conservatory, privately. She accepted 4 students a year, chosen from applications that Victor's office handled, always with the same criteria: exceptional talent, limited resources, and evidence of the particular quality Elena could identify in an audition within the first 4 minutes. Hunger. Not ambition, hunger. The difference mattered enormously to Elena. The first student she accepted was a girl named Sophia, 12 years old, from a working-class family on the south side of Chicago, whose application had included a recording made on a phone balanced on a kitchen counter of a girl playing a piece she had taught herself by watching videos on the internet. Elena watched the video once. Called Victor. Said, "This one. Arrange it." Sophia arrived at Elena's studio for the first lesson looking like she expected to be sent back home. Elena sat across from her, looked at her for a long moment and said, "Do you know what your ears can do?" "No, you don't. We're going to spend the next few years finding out." Time in Elena's life moved the way it moves for people who fill it completely, faster than it should, and fuller than it feels. By the time she was 50, she had recorded 14 albums. 11 had reached the top of classical music charts in the United States. 3 had crossed into mainstream visibility, reviewed in publications that did not ordinarily cover classical music, discussed on radio programs outside the genre, heard in films and television series that brought her work to audiences who had never set foot in a concert hall. She had performed in 31 countries. She had given, by her own count, thousands of concerts, including an outdoor performance in a city park in Chicago, free of charge, attended by 40,000 people, that music journalists described as one of the significant cultural events of the decade. She had been interviewed on every major American network, featured on the covers of national magazines, not just music publications but general interest magazines, news magazines, the kind of covers that say to a culture, this person matters in a way that goes beyond their field. She had never changed the program, never removed Irena's compositions, never stopped giving the spoken introductions that audiences had come to expect, the quiet, specific stories about where the music came from and what it had cost. At 52, Elena established the Irena Foundation, a nonprofit that funded music education for children from low-income families across Chicago, and eventually, across the country. It was not a grand institution, did not want to be. It was, Elena said at the founding event, a shelf for people who have something to say and nowhere to say it. By the time Elena was 60, the foundation had funded the musical education of over 300 young people. 14 of them had gone on to professional careers. One of them, Sophia, the girl from the South Side with the kitchen counter recording, was by then performing in concert halls across Europe and had released her own debut album dedicated, in the liner notes, to Elena and to a woman named Irena. Sophia had never met Irena, but she knew her music, and she played it the way you play something that belongs to you because someone you loved gave it to you. There is a question that journalists asked Elena many times over the years, in many different forms. What would have happened if you hadn't found that piano in the shelter? If Victor Crane hadn't been in the room? If the notebook hadn't survived? Elena's answers varied, but the center of all of them was the same. The music would have found its way. That's what I believe. Not because I was special, but because music, when it is real, does not stop. It finds the available instrument. It finds the available hands. It finds the available moment. What I am grateful for is not the talent. The talent was my mother's gift. What I am grateful for is that I was not silent. That when they took everything else, I played. Elena is 73 years old. She has not announced this performance. There is no audience. The stage is dark except for the light above the piano. She opens the notebook, Irena's notebook, the cover worn soft now from 55 years of hands, to the first page. She plays. She plays the first composition her mother ever wrote. The one she played in the shelter. The one she played in the West Village. The one she played at Carnegie Hall. The one she has played in 31 countries to audiences of thousands and to audiences of 80 and once to an audience of one, a dying man in a hospital in Chicago who had requested it specifically. She plays it here alone in an empty hall in the dark because this is where she began. Not in the hall. In the music. In the moment when the hands find the keys and the keys find the sound and the sound finds the only thing that was ever being said. I was here. I am here. And I refuse to be silent. Elena's story is not a story about music. It is a story about what happens when the thing inside you, the true irreducible thing, refuses to be buried under the weight of what the world has done to you. Every generation produces people like Elena, people who carry something through the darkness that should not have survived and somehow do. If you carry something like that, if you have a story of survival, of reconstruction, of a self that refused to disappear, write to us at vellumoflife@gmail.com. Your identity is completely protected. Your story will be told with respect, care, and the anonymity that makes truth possible. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you carry a story of your own, you are already part of this. Write to us and become part of the community we are building together. Thank you for watching. Until the next chapter.